Okay, ring the bell, class is in session. Today we're going to talk about how affirmative action, otherwise known as Executive Order 11246, signed into law by President Lyndon Baines Johnson in 1965, has failed the Negroes here in the city of Port Arthur when it comes to employment at these local refineries that are receiving federal contract money to produce jet fuel. Okay, we do know for a fact that in the past 20 years, the city of Port Arthur has had one of the highest unemployment rates in the state of Texas. One would scratch their head and figure, with all this work going on at all these refineries, how come the city of Port Arthur has such high unemployment figures? The answer is quite simple. These refineries have not been complying with the Executive Order 11246 for decades. And the proof is in the pudding when you look at the employment stats in the city. Now, first of all, let's take a look at what is affirmative action. Affirmative action basically, like I said, was established in 1965 when President Johnson signed the Executive Order 11246 into law. And he gave the Department of Labor Office of Federal Contract Compliance the authority to enforce this law. And this law is, the guidelines for this law is based on the Office of Federal Contract Compliance and the Code of Federal Regulations. We're going to look at Chapter 60, specifically 60-2, affirmative action programs, which are required by every federal contractor who receives money from the government. Now, we know these refineries here in the city of Port Arthur have probably received billions of dollars to produce this jet fuel that they manufacture over the past 35, 40 years. The question is, have they been keeping affirmative action programs on file and in place? You can look here and see what the requirements are for an affirmative action program. These are the things that they're required to do. Now, the first affirmative action plan that was required to be submitted by these refineries was probably sometime in the early 1970s. Okay, and how the government checks to see whether or not these affirmative action plans are being upheld is by having the company submit EEO1 reports on an annual basis. Let's go here to where they talk about the EEO1 reports, as you can see right here. Okay, they're supposed to submit their EEO1 reports every by March 31st of every year. And the EEO1 reports give you the contractor's demographics based on sex and race. And they break down several job requirements. So basically, once you establish your affirmative action plan, you are to grade it by the statistical numbers that you report to the government every year. That's how you know whether or not your affirmative action plan is successful or not. Okay, now let's go back to the affirmative action plan here again, chapter 60.2. Now, case in point, these guys, since the early 70s, have been required to submit affirmative action plans or updates to their affirmative action plans every year. Now, we know for a fact, like I said, Port Arthur has been having one of the highest unemployment rates in the state of Texas for the past 40, 45 years. So what's been happening with these guys' affirmative action plans here in the city? Evidently, their affirmative action plans haven't been working. Otherwise, you would not see this poor performance in the employment sector here in the city of Port Arthur. So we know for a fact that a lot of government agencies really don't, follow or do the job they're dedicated to do in terms of, what they're required to do. Case in point, the Indian Bureau of Affairs, all the treaties that were broken by the U.S. government where the Indian Bureau of Affairs is supposed to protect these people. We know they didn't. It's the same thing with affirmative action. The Department of Labor for the past 35, 40 years hadn't really been enforcing these laws. And Congressman Major Owens back in 1994 had a hearing to examine the performance of the EEOC and the Department of Labor when it comes to enforcing these federal contract laws. And what we found out in this hearing was that these guys were not actually enforcing the laws. The laws are on the book, but the Department of Labor actually was not enforcing the laws. As you can see, I was one of the participants back in Washington, D.C. Back in 1994, Major Owens flew me from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C. to participate in this hearing. So the question is, what are we going to do about this here in Port Arthur? Now, I've mentioned since 2002, as early as 2002, the city of Port Arthur needs to have its own compliance department. The mayor used this idea in his campaign platform last year, because we know these refineries are not complying with the Executive Order 11246, specifically their affirmative action plan, because if they would, you would not see these really, really terrible numbers in employment that you see here in the city of Port Arthur. So if you ever wonder why the city of Port Arthur is in such dire straits from an economic standpoint, whereas all these refineries in the city are making record profits, now you can understand what's really going on. These guys are getting your federal contract money to produce jet fuel, but yet they are not complying with the laws set forth by Lyndon Johnson's 1965 Executive Order 11246. No more talk.